Welcome to Don't Give Up on Testicular Cancer, a podcast where testicular cancer survivors, caregivers, and others who have navigated the cancer journey share their stories. The podcast comes to you from the Max Mallory Foundation, a nonprofit family foundation focused on educating about testicular cancer in honor and in memory of Max Mallory, who died in 2016 at the young age of 22 from testicular cancer. Had he survived, Max wanted to help young adults with cancer. This podcast helps meet that goal. Here now is your host, Joyce Lofstrom, Max's mom and a young adult cancer survivor.
Hi, this is Joyce, and with me today is Dan Duffy. He's been telling stories for over 20 years. Following an award-winning radio career with the nationally syndicated Steve and DC radio show, he transitioned from audio to visual arts and graduated from the Vancouver Film School. Before moving to Los Angeles, he came back to his hometown of St. Louis, Missouri, to sharpen his skills. However, fate, a woman in a cancer diagnosis, changed everything. 4 months before moving to the West Coast, he met Stephanie, the woman he would marry. 4 months after that, Dan received a diagnosis of stage 3 testicular cancer. And then 6 months later, Dan was cancer-free. So he's here 22 years later to discuss how his healthcare crisis led him to help others who face a cancer diagnosis. So, Dan, I'm so glad you could be with me today.
So nice to be here. Thank you for having me.
So before I start asking about your cancer story, I just want to let you tell us a little bit about your storytelling and how that talent has influenced your career and your personal life.
So I think I've been telling stories kind of my whole life. I remember when we were very young, my parents got a little video recorder and I just started playing with it and having fun with it. And I was just really drawn to the medium of kind of storytelling. And after high school, I did not really go the traditional college route because I was an absolutely terrible student. But I remember my job, I was actually a delivery driver. I used to listen to this particular radio show and they were so good at telling stories over and over and over again. And that's what I want to do. So I actually went to DJ school and somehow wrote them a letter. They liked it and they had me in for an interview and thus began like a 5-year career with the Steve and DC radio show. And those guys were two of the best storytellers I ever worked with in my entire life. But about 4 years in, I started burning out because this was morning radio and I never got a lick of sleep at all. And I remember one day at lunch, my parents go, what do you want to do? Like, do you want to keep doing this? And I said, no, I would love to make films and videos and that kind of thing. And I would love to kind of explore the visual medium. And so I did. And after my 5th year, I took a year of school here in St. Louis. I went to the Vancouver Film School. I graduated. I've been making videos now. This is my 25th year. And
Wow.
and I picked the right career path because I still love what I do. And I still love getting to meet people and help them tell their stories. And one of the ways that I used to do that was by blogging. And I'll never forget, after a couple of blogs, the Huffington Post actually somehow picked one up and they're like, how'd you like to blog for us? So I did that for a few years and I just really kind of honed in on finding what unites us really. And a lot of what unites us is our stories. St. Louis is one of those weird places where it's one of those places that very few people leave and the people who do leave end up coming back. And sometimes the people who come here end up never leaving at all. Like, for instance, there was a player who played for the St. Louis Blues named Keith Tkachuk, and he became a Blue, and he didn't end his career as a Blue, but he ended up moving back to St. Louis because this was home. And so I think that's one thing that we always try to do is we try to look for these ties that bind us together. And I think one of the greatest ways to do that is by learning people's stories. And then if they're comfortable telling them, great. And if they're not, if they allow me to help tell them, I'm thrilled.
That's wonderful. You're lucky to find that career path and still love it. Not everybody can say that. So, and I'll just say one more thing. I get coming back home. I'm from Kansas City, and It's just your friends are there, everything you are familiar with. That's cool. I think that's really nice that, people come and stay, and you've uncovered
It
that.
is.
So,
And I was very blessed that out of film school, there was a tiny little video production company here in St. Louis that was looking to expand. And that's how I got my foot in the door. It's how I got
yeah,
my first professional job. And to find it back in my hometown, that's almost unheard of.
yeah, that's very true. That's true.
Mhm.
Well, let's segue back over to testicular cancer and
Okay.
just kind of tell us your story, anything you want to share about it, and we'll keep talking about that path.
Actually, we're going to rewind maybe like about 6 months before my
Sure.
diagnosis.
Yep.
I started having really just acute back pain. And it wouldn't last very long. Like just like a sharp pain here or there. A couple of times it actually dropped me. And then I was wondering, what happened. And it turns out that back in 1996, I had a really bad Jeep accident. I was hit from behind by a car that had slowed down, according to accident reconstruction, by the cops to approximately 100 miles an hour before impact. And I ended up getting thrown from the Jeep. And so my back pain, I just assumed was an old injury cropping back up. But then the pain started becoming less acute and more severe and more constant. I had met the woman who became my wife actually on Halloween night. We had been maybe dating for 4 months, and she saw what kind of pain I was in. I tried all sorts of things from an epidural steroid injection to chiropractic. I had a really good chiropractor who helped me with it. And I'll never forget one early morning in March. It was a Saturday morning and I was dying. Like, I'm Catholic, so the thought of ending it all never entered my mind. But at that point, I was actually asking God to take away my pain by any means necessary because I just couldn't handle it anymore. And I remember I called my chiropractor friend and he goes, Danny, we've got to lower that. We've got to just loosen up that back. So lay on the end of the bed and put your feet down and then just kind of pull one leg up at a time. And I pulled my right leg up, which was fine. Then I pulled my left leg up and I felt something move in my abdomen. And then I pushed down and it felt like a golf ball. Like it was about that size and it was really hard. And so I remember I ended up telling my wife, that day, I told Stephanie, I found a lump in my abdomen and she felt it and she goes, yeah, that's not normal. You have got to get to a doctor. But what's weird is I was a 29-year-old boy. 29-year-old boys don't have doctors.
Right.
I haven't seen a doctor in years. And so I went to what my mom calls a doc in the box, which is one of those places like in acute care, like there are now today. But like they're pretty rare back then, but that's where you went if you didn't have a doc. He pushed on it and he goes, that shouldn't be there. And he walked out of the room and I thought, oh, it's probably a boil and he's going to lance it. And he comes back with 2 phone numbers and he said, call one of these guys. This is beyond my scope. And then I started getting really scared. I ended up getting in touch with a doctor named Richard Pinnell, who was a surgeon. He felt it. He ordered an emergency CAT scan for the very next day. And the CAT scan came back. And then literally a day after I had it, there was a partial diagnosis of possible lymphoma is what it looked like. Apparently that little golf ball was, I hate to call it, but it was the tip of the iceberg. Like it was literally part of a massive tumor that had grown up into my abdomen. It had encapsulated my pancreas. It had atrophied my left kidney. And they said, you have a choice. We can do a needle biopsy and be like 80% sure of what you have, or we can cut you open and take a piece out and be like definitive. And I said, I want to know what this is because I want to know how to kill it because I can't take this anymore. And so they did the biopsy and it was stage 3 testicular. And I'll never forget. So my oncologist is a guy named Dr. Bert Needles, which is the greatest name for an oncologist ever. And he's a brilliant oncologist. I mean, this guy's world renowned. I was so lucky to have him in St. Louis. And he called me and he goes, we've hit a home run. It's testicular. I'm like, so you're telling me I have cancer? He goes, yeah, but this is great news. I'm like, no, you are telling me I have cancer. And he's like, yeah. Okay, I get your point. And I'm sorry. Yes, you have cancer, but we're going to cure you. Like, so when you have a doctor that says that to you, I had I had no qualms whatsoever. I'm like, yes, I am going to get cured. I have the right doctor. I have a great team. I am so very blessed. And the thought of not making it out alive didn't cross my mind. It again. So, and I know that is probably, a foolish way to think about things, because I've since learned that while testicular cancer is 95% curable, it's not 100% curable. I just had it in my mind. I'm like, this is it. I'm going to be fine. And that's how I looked at it.
Yeah. That attitude makes such a difference. I'm a cancer survivor too, and it's like you have to have that attitude to get through it, and you keep going, and so that's an admirable thing that you were able to do.
I had a lot of people around me that really helped, and like from out of nowhere, a guy I went to film school with is from Japan. His name's Shinsuke, and he actually sent a message to me that said, we say that the heart heals the body, so keep going with this. Like, so you hear things like that. Like a guy I went to high school with, Bobby, he was far more connected than I was, and he reached out to literally every kid that graduated from our high school. And then I started getting messages from people I hadn't seen since graduation day. So it had been over 20 years. And they're like, you've got this, keep going. I know how much, like from my friends and my family and my parents and my brother and Stephanie, who was there, like I will never forget when the CT scan came back and they thought it was lymphoma. I called her that day. She was on a rotation she was studying to be a pharmacist. And I said, look, they think I have lymphoma. If you don't want to be here for this, I will understand. She goes, no, we're going to fight this every step of the way together. So I know how blessed I was to have just, it takes a village. I had a city and a country and a world around me that backed me up. So I don't ever discount how much they are responsible for you and I speaking here today.
No, I agree. That family support, friends, it all makes a huge difference. So I know from reading your book, the half book, that you had chemo, 4 rounds of chemo, and
yeah.
Pretty intense situation. And you want to just talk about that a little bit there? I know I want to also ask you about the fertility stuff, because I think a lot of men want to hear that and how it worked out for you, because it was very positive. So
Sure. So, and this is sort of crazy what happened with chemotherapy. So I was so convinced with Dr. Needles and what he had prescribed. He had prescribed a cocktail of 3 drugs, and it was cisplatin, VP16, and bleomycin. And bleo is one of those, I think the nickname is the carpet bomber, because it just kills everything. And so I'll never forget. So he's like, this is what we're going to do. Do you have any questions? And my mom, who's my advocate, she didn't have a question. She trusted that this was the best possible way of going. My dad, who just has never spoken up to a doctor, said, doc, my dad died of esophageal cancer, and ever since I've been donating to Memorial Sloan Kettering in his honor. Is there any way you would just reach out to them to make sure that this is the best course of action? You have to understand, this is 4 days before I'm supposed to start my first infusion.
Yeah.
And Dr. Needles goes, well, I did my residency at Sloan Kettering. I'll be happy to call him. Not only was he happy to call them, he called them that afternoon and talked to one of his colleagues, and the colleague said, this is going to be bizarre, but we literally just ended a study. It has not even been published yet, but it shows that for your patient's particular type of cancer, bleomycin is medically unnecessary. And so I went from 3 to 2, which played a huge part in my life later on. But not having bleo did so many things for me.
Right. That's wonderful. All right. So you got through all that. Your book has a good catheter story that I think it was really, I know you don't have to talk about it, but it was a great solution that your friend came up with. So
it was it's funny. All of my guy friends, it's their favorite chapter in the book.
Oh, really?
It is by far the most painful, both physically and psychologically. But it was actually one of the most fun chapters, one of the fun things I've ever written in my life. So Dr. Needles wanted to get a PET scan. I had been through my 4 rounds and they threw everything at it, and he wanted to make sure, and PET scans were brand new at this stage. You have to know this is 2002. So I mean, they were such new technology, and he was just giddy to try it, and I was going to be his guinea pig. And so he's like, we're going to have a PET scan, and here's what you'll do. And you'll go in, and it looks like a CAT scan machine, but it does a whole lot more. And so like, we'll catheterize you and stuff. And I'm like, wait, what? Like, I'd never had a catheter in my life. And it turns out that I am a little different down there because most boys are circumcised and I was not. And so I knew I was in trouble when I'm laying in the bed and the orderly comes in and he lifts the gown and goes, oh, and goes over to the phone in the room and is like, yes, we'll need an extra pair of hands down here. And so started World War III. And at one point, like it was horrific. At one point, one of the orderlies goes, do you want this up there or not? And I'm like, are you kidding me? Is this a trick question? So I ended up having the PET scan, and it was just a horrific experience. But I was told by Dr. Needles, this is definitive. Either you have cancer or you don't. I was never told there was a potential door number 3 because I don't think he knew there was. So I went into the meeting afterwards. I'm like, so do I have it or not? He goes, the test was inconclusive. We're going to have to do it again. I'm like, oh, no, we're not. And I hit that point. There's a comedian named comedian named Robert Schimmel. God rest his soul. He passed away, though not from cancer, but he wrote an amazing book called Cancer on $5 a Day. And he talked about the insidious part of cancer that most people that he knew, including himself, get to a point to where you don't think the cancer is going to kill you, but you don't actually care if it does. Like your ability to be a willing patient hits a wall. And this was my wall. And I stopped. I'm like, I'm not doing anything else. I'm not doing this again. And Dr. Needles is like, please, my mother's in hysterics. My dad is like, I totally understand, but I would really like you to have this. And I put my foot down. I said, I'm never doing this again. Like I literally said, give me more chemotherapy. That's how bad it was.
Wow.
And the doctor goes, we can't do that. And I said, fine, put me out. He goes, we can't waste hospital resources for something that's uncomfortable. And I'm like, you have no idea what uncomfortable means. Like, to me, like this was it. And so I was with my friends a few nights later. I was getting calls every day from Dr. Needles' office. I'm like, I'm not doing it. I'm not doing it. I'm not doing it. And one night I'm at dinner with friends and I told them all about it. And of course they're laughing, which is, that's what good friends do. Like they wallow with you in your misery and they laugh at you and like they get a good story out of it. But I'll never forget, and still to this day, like there's not a single friend who remembers saying this, but I know I heard it. A friend goes, well, you could pull a Jesus. I'm like, what do you mean pull a Jesus? He goes, well, what did Jesus do before he died? I'm like, well, he was crucified. He goes, no, before that. I'm like, he carried the cross. He goes, no, before that. I'm like, he was sentenced by Pilate. He goes, no, before that. I'm like, he made a reservation for 13. I don't know what you're asking me. And he goes, he fasted. I'm like, yeah. So he goes, well, why do you need the PET scan? I'm like, or he goes, why do you need the catheter? I said, to prevent a false positive for anything that's in my system. He goes, well, what if there's nothing in your system? And like, my jaw dropped. And I called Dr. Needles the next day. I'm like, I will do your PET scan. He goes, that's great. I'm like, on one condition. He goes, what? I said, I am not getting catheterized and I'm not eating or drinking for 3 days. He goes, oh, no. You're going to suffer dehydration. I'm like, I don't care. I'll take the dehydration. I said, in theory, would this work? And this is how amazing this doctor was. Not only was he the doctor who agreed to look into, whether his diagnosis of a cocktail would work, but then he literally thought about it. And he goes, yeah, in theory, it would work. And I said, you want the test? This is my body. This is my choice. And he agreed.
Wow.
And so I had the PET scan 3 days later and there was no catheterization. And yeah, I was a little bit dehydrated and I lost a little bit of weight, but it came back conclusive that I no longer had cancer.
And that's what you needed right there. So yeah.
That's what I wanted. And to have a doctor that would actually work with me, especially one so renowned, and I was just the lowly patient. Like you hear nowadays where there's a real effort to try get patients and physicians and the healthcare team to work together, because while doctors know cures, patients know their body.
Right.
And so to have that back like in '02, that was a gift from God. That was amazing.
Yeah, you're right. Back then, that was a big deal to be able to do
Mhm.
that, and for him to listen to
Absolutely.
you.
Yeah.
That's.
Yeah.
So I know from the book tour, just from reading about you, and I mean, you have your wonderful wife Stephanie and your two sons, but you also had the fertility challenge. And well, the one thing I really wanted to talk about that is what you found out with your sperm after all your chemo, how it was working, because you had three different categories, right? Of what
Yeah.
they were
Yeah.
working, not or whatever. I'll let you tell that story. But I thought that was very interesting, and not everybody knows that that could happen, I don't think.
So Dr. Needles, before I had chemotherapy, like he actually said, "So do you want to have children?" And I just blurted out, "With you?" And he goes, "No." He goes, "Do you want to have kids someday?" And I'd never thought about it. And I
Yeah.
said, "Yeah, maybe." He goes, "Well, you may want to go to the fertility clinic and leave a deposit." And so it was the morning I was supposed to start chemotherapy. I had my first one at 11 o'clock. So at 9 o'clock, I went to the facility. And because of both the pressure and what my friend referred to as you probably had suboptimal filth to kind of lead you along that path, I couldn't finish,
Yeah.
for lack of a better word, but I couldn't postpone my chemo either. So I had chemotherapy like that day, and I was terrified the entire day. And so I had said to the person while leaving, like, "What am I supposed to do?" And they're like, "All right, take the cup home." And then they give you like these gymnastics, like you can't touch the inside of the cup, but the cup cap has to be on like until right before it happens. But then, and you have to make sure this, and it is terrifying. Like
Yeah.
you have to get so many things right, or so they say. And so the pressure was ridiculous, just ridiculous. So I ended up being able to get them a sample the day after I started chemotherapy. And I was terrified like the entire time, like going through it, that I may never be able to have kids, because I didn't know like how chemo would affect it. So fast forward about 3 years, my wife and I had been married for about a year, and we are going to start to try to have kids. And so I said, I need to, before we go the IVF route, let me go check to see where I am, basically. So I had a urologist named Dr. Leonard Gaum who had a wit as dry as the Sahara. And after I had done what I needed to do for the test, he comes in, he goes, "Well, I've got bad news, and good news." And I'm like, "Oh my God." I'm like, "All right, fine. What's the first bad news?" Because the first bad news is 1/3 are completely dead. I'm like, "Okay, what's the second bad news?" He goes, 1/3 are completely useless. I'm like, "Well, define useless." He goes, "Picture a boat without a rudder." And I'm like, "That's completely useless." And I said, "All right, well, then what's the good news?" And he said, "The good news is 1/3 are completely fine." And he said, "There
Wow.
is no medical reason why you cannot have kids." And then like he did like a little magic trick with his hands. He goes, "Good luck." And I'm like, huh. Like that, I did not expect at all. And then I went back to the phone call that Dr. Needles had that day where he said bleomycin was not medically necessary. Now Dr. Needles says it's because, oh, you were young and healthy. Like if he saw what I ate and how I polluted my body, I was not healthy. I may have been young, but health had nothing to do with this. I have to think that if I had bleomycin, Stephanie and I don't have the children we have today.
Really.
And we had even said we were maybe going to try the IVF route once. And if it didn't work, we were never going to have kids, and we were going to move to New York, and because that was our favorite place. And that was going to be life. But the fact that we had two children like the natural way, and I'll never forget when our oldest is Sam, and Ben came 2 years and 2 months after Sammy did. And after Ben turned 3, never forget, I went into the place where I had made the deposit and I said, I will not be renewing the cryogenic. And the guy goes, "Are you okay?" And I'm like, "Yeah." And I actually showed him a picture of both of my boys and he just smiled. And I walked out of there and I thought to myself, this is not actually the end. It's just the end of the beginning. I did not know where my life would take me after that, but I knew that like this chapter was finally closed. And
I think that's,
that meant everything to me.
But I thought the whole thing with the bleomycin is I didn't know that perhaps, you had active sperm because you didn't have it. I mean, in the
And
timing.
there's nothing that medically says that, but I also know that. So my wife's dad is a pharmacist, and when he heard that I was supposed to get bleomycin, like he was like, "Oh," like because bleo's given to a lot of people with cancer, and it's very effective. But the fact that its nickname is the carpet bomber, like in some medical circles, I I thank God every day that I didn't have to have it. Cisplatin was bad enough. Like so cisplatin is platinum based, and Dr. Larry Einhorn, he was at IUPUI, and in 1975 he had been working with platinum and how they interacted with cancer cells, and his tests were so conclusive after round 2. Usually there's a round 3 and FDA approval. They skipped round 3 and the trials were done and the FDA gave approval. And overnight, he turned a testicular cancer diagnosis from 50-50 survivable to 95% curable. Yeah. Just by using that. And platinum is used now on so many other cancers as well. It is brutal. Don't get me wrong. And I know there's better drugs now that are being used to kind of alleviate the effects of it. But a platinum-based drug like cisplatin is like number 1 for nausea causing. I mean, it is brutal. Thank God I did not have to have bleomycin on top of that.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, just the outcome. So I wanted our listeners to hear that. So yeah, it's important, I think, to know that. So how about your biggest challenge during all this? I mean, you had a lot going on, and what was your biggest challenge?
Your biggest physical challenge is nausea, because nausea is not nausea. Like usually, like when you think of nausea, you think, "Oh, I ate something wrong, or I imbibed, a few too many drinks," and you throw up and then you feel better. Maybe you throw up twice and then you feel better, but eventually you do. Nausea is different on chemotherapy because it doesn't kick in for like a week. And after you do throw up, you don't actually feel better. Nothing feels better. And so like after a day, you're hoping, you know what, maybe this will subside. And like day 2, it doesn't. And day 3, it doesn't. And then you start to get really nervous because you start to get afraid to put anything in your system because you know where it's going. And that's when I ended up discovering that bananas are the greatest food ever, because not only do you get potassium and they're healthy for you, but they're the least repulsive throwing up because they taste the exact same way going both directions. And that makes a huge difference. So nausea is big. I'm a big fan of what I call week 3. So the way my treatment went, I would do Monday through Friday for 4 hours a day. So there's 2 liters of chemo going into my system every day. And then like around like Friday, it kicks in. So that entire second week, you feel just terrible. But I will never forget, like 2 Fridays after I finished chemo, like you wake up and you realize you start to feel more of yourself. And that's the whole thing. Like It's not just a physical thing, it's a psychological thing. Like I'm really, really convinced of this, that my doctor was smart enough to say, you're going to have chemo for a week. You're going to feel awful for a week. And then you're going to feel great. And like that week 3, you want to take on the world. You want to get out of your house. You want to eat anything that sounds good, which is not necessarily a great thing. I mean, it is, but you're like, "Oh, I'm back to normal." No, you're not. Like your insides, there is nothing back to normal. And not only that, but chemotherapy it gets worse as it goes. So the nausea and the things that you feel in round 4 are hellacial compared to what you felt in round 1. They compound and they do get worse. But that week 3 is always like the greatest feeling in the world. Yeah, it was. So that's the physical. I think the biggest thing I learned, and it's the biggest mistake I made. So I was actually staying at my parents' house during treatment. And what happened was I didn't want to be a burden, especially being like a young man. I didn't want to be a burden. And so like my mom would be like, like, how are you? And I'm like, I'm fine. She goes, like, can I get you a banana? I'm like, no, you know what? That sounds good, but I'm going to go down and do it. I would like to do everything for myself. And I wanted to hide as much from her as I possibly could because I didn't want her to over worry. And the thing that I really learned is that if you're not honest and you try to shoulder the burden, your loved one's thoughts will go into worse places than you probably actually are. So my mother thought oh my God, he's going to die. When in reality, if I just said, you know what, I feel awful. The nausea is just absolutely cracking me this time. And I'm going to feel this way for the next 3 to 4 days and it's going to suck. But then I'm going to feel better and a breeze is going to blow through the house. But I hid that. And sure enough, like when my mom and I talked about it later, she went to some really dark places. And so I really did learn that the more honest I could be, not only could I have unshouldered some of the burden that I was going through, but I did what I wanted to do. Like I would have done rather what I wanted to do. I wanted to unburden her. And by just letting her in, and then my friends and Stephanie and everything, by just letting them in, I could have facilitated what I wanted in the first place. And that was just for them to not worry about me so much. So I learned a lot, both physical and psychological. And it took a little while for myself to have the grace to forgive myself for the mistakes that I felt that I made during treatment.
Well, the fact that you talked with your mom afterwards and kind of that, I would think that would help both of you to have that conversation about, how you felt and what happened and how she felt. So not all people would have done that, to actually sit down and, talk about your feelings after it was all done. I just admire that because I remember some of the things with my mom too. It's hard. You're worried about yourself and then you worry about them worrying about you. And it's too much. At least for me, it was. So,
So I'll never forget this. So we were doing some stuff with the American Cancer Society and they were doing a Relay for Life event. And it was one of the overnight ones. And we ended up talking to a lady, telling stories. So we had set up a camera and a chair, in the middle of it. And I talked to her and I'm like, well, why do you relay? She goes, I relay for my dad. And this is probably about 10 years after I'd gone through treatment. And she goes, I relay for my dad. And then and she had a real scowl on her face. She was mad. And I said, I'm so sorry. She goes, no, you know what? She goes, I'm still mad at him. And I'm going, wow, okay. Do you want to talk about it? And she opened up. And what was crazy was he had done the exact same thing that I had done. This is actually what precipitated the talk with my mom, because I probably would have just held on to it and life is happier and we didn't have to go visit this again. But this woman, when she was 18 years old, her father had cancer and it was terminal. And he did not tell her until he went into the hospital for the last time and didn't come out. He'd been battling for a year. And as a typical 18-year-old, she never spent time with her parents. She would spend time with friends and doing, what 18-year-olds do. And I know why he did it. He was trying to lift or keep a burden from his daughter. But his daughter looked at it the complete opposite direction. She said, if I knew that he was sick, I would have spent more time with him. And then when he went into the hospital and I found out he was not coming out, it was such a shock to the system. And I feel so cheated by him that I could have had 6 quality months with him before he died. And this was 30 years ago. Mm-hmm. And she has still not been able to unburden herself from that weight. And like, that's when it really hit me like, oh my God, what did I do? And the road to hell is always paved with good intentions. And I know like the good intentions that a lot of times people who go through cancer have, like, no, we have to keep this to ourselves or minimize it at all. But man, when we do, not always, but sometimes it has the equal and opposite effect. And that taught me a lot. Like, and I still pray for that woman to this day. And I hope she has been able to forgive her dad and put that baggage down.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned the American Cancer Society, because I know when you got through your cancer and knew it wasn't there, that you have spent pretty much your life now helping others with cancer, or charities or different things like that. Can you just talk about some of the things you have done and are doing and why?
Sure. So when I finished, I'll never forget, my last cancer treatment actually didn't happen in the infusion center where the, like all the recliners and everything are. My doctor had actually given me permission. There was a trip that our family had planned to Ireland, and it was going to be very much truncated, and it was supposed to happen like the week that I was going to start round 4 of chemotherapy. But he was really, really thrilled with my progress. And he goes, okay, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to let you skip a week. You're going to be feeling great. I want you to go and I want you to have fun and come back, and we're going to knock this thing out. And I ended up getting home on a Monday. So for the 5 days, Tuesday through Friday was in the infusion center. And Saturday, I was not surrounded by the nurses who saw me every day. Like, there was no bell ring. There was no nothing. I was actually, they had to admit me in the hospital, and I had the chemo, and the staff came in and visited me for a little bit while she was going home to see her brand new niece, who was the first niece in the family. And I walked out of there by myself, and the lady was just like, have a nice day. And I'll never forget, I walked maybe like halfway down the hallway, and I looked back and I'm like, what the hell just happened? And I realized that I now had this new set of tools and information, and I would be crazy to keep it to myself. And so I sort of jumped right back in, and the first thing I started doing was I started blogging, and people started to respond to it. And like, that's when the Huffington Post read one, and they're like, we would like you to blog for us. And so I did. We got together with, there's an organization called Stupid Cancer, and they're amazing. And they help young adults like 18 to 40 and it was started by a guy named Matt Zachary. And the reason why he started it was he had a brain tumor in his late teens. And when he looked for places to help him cope with this, there was nothing. And so they started Stupid Cancer. And so they have a thing called CancerCon. It's their biggest convention of the year. And a friend of mine, Joe Farmer, and we actually went to CancerCon, and we did this thing called the 5-minute blog. And we had 5 questions and 5 minutes. And we were hoping maybe to get 10 people to sit down with us, and we were going to write a blog for the Huffington Post. 63 people sat down with us, and they answered our questions, and they ran the gamut. Like, I will never forget. One lady said, don't buy 5 pieces of crappy headgear, buy 2 good ones. I'm like, all right, well, what necessitates a good one? She goes, take the hat or the headgear or whatever, she goes, and rub it on the inside of your arm. And if it doesn't itch there, it's not going to itch your head. And I'm like, oh, like, I mean, these were things that like people could use. And so that turned into a 5-part series for the Huffington Post instead of just like one little blog. That was enormous. Our local American Cancer Society picked up on this, and they said, we have this board here in St. Louis called the St. Louis Leadership Board. We would like you to serve on it, which was just one of the honors of my life. And so I've actually been on the board now for about 6.5 years, and we're still going. I still do some video production work for them to help get their story out. I don't know if you've heard of a place with the American Cancer Society called Hope Lodge, but if you live outside of 50 miles and you're getting treatment, so Siteman in St. Louis, they are cutting edge treatment. And I know Mercy Cancer Care is also cutting edge treatment as well. And some people, like in more rural areas, they get sent to like these bigger facilities where they have more options available. And so there's Hope Lodges all over the country. And if you live outside of 50 miles where your treatment is, you can stay at these places free of charge.
Wow.
I mean, it is really staggering. And the rooms, it's not just like the person going through cancer, the patient and a caregiver get to stay together for as long as it takes. If you need, a weekend, it's a weekend. I met someone who literally stayed there a year,
Oh,
and
Dan.
they were getting treatment, and they were never charged. Like, you bring in your own food, but like there's laundry facilities there free of charge. Like, there's always people like donating, like toiletries and, like liquid washing detergent and stuff. Like, you're given space in a fridge. Oh my God, these places are unbelievable. I know there's one in New York, there's one in St. Louis, and they change lives. And so I love helping to get to tell those stories, and the fact that the American Cancer Society trusts me to do it, man, oh man, like it's one of the honors of my life.
Yeah. Yeah. That's wonderful that you do all that. I mean, it really is. It's helped so many people, I think. So.
And there's lots of places, like I know there's one called the Cancer Support Community. There's one in St. Louis. I know Gilda's Club up in Wisconsin is a cancer support community. There's one in Dallas. And this is a place, like, the thing that I love is that people used to compete. Like, the American Cancer Society used to compete with Cancer Support Community, used to compete with this organization or that organization. And what everybody's figured out was they all have a role.
Right.
Like, the American Cancer Society, they are the largest non-governmental funder of cancer research in America. Like, it's massive. But like the cancer support community, like, these are like soft landings for both patients and their loved ones who just need a break from what they're going through. And so, like, I know in the St. Louis area, the ACS and CSC, they work together.
Right.
And it's phenomenal. And the fact that we are all on the same team, like, we do not need to be competing, because giving and empathy and compassion is not a zero-sum game.
Yeah.
Like, if it's important enough to you, you will find the will and find the way to make a difference in the lives of others.
Well, you talked about different people and why they have begun like a stupid cancer, and why was it Zachary started
Matt
it?
Zachary, yeah. Yep.
And I've talked to other young adults. One of them, it's now called the Cactus Cancer Society, but the woman who started it I think she had lymphoma, and she had nowhere to go. And Emmerman Angels, Johnny Emmerman started it. He had testicular cancer, and it was in that same era that you had your treatment. I mean, I think it's made such a difference when people actually try to do that and reach out to other people.
Absolutely. So, and just like with testicular cancer, like there's the Testicular Cancer Association, there's the Testicular Cancer Society, and that is run by a guy named Mike Craycraft, who is encyclopedic. Mike's amazing. Mike's a dear friend, and it's one of the most crazy things in the world. So he's a pharmacist by trade,
right, yeah.
and he has an encyclopedic brain of people with cancer. So whenever I have a friend or someone I know who gets diagnosed with cancer and they're not sure where to go, I call Mike and I'm like, okay, Mike, this is what I got. This person, it's stage 2 lymphoma, and they're presenting with this and and they're based in this part of the country. Like, okay, well, if they're in Seattle, there's the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Institute and blah, blah. I'm like, and it's amazing. And he's never not helped me. I've reached out to my own oncologist, Dr. Needles. I said, if you had I have a friend who had gray zone leukemia, which is really rare. I'm like, if you had this, where would you go? Like, okay, this is the doctor I would go to. This is where they are. We are all in this together. And if we can make a difference in the lives, if we can make it just a little bit easier, because cancer is hard enough. And a lot of times we tend to beat ourselves up over it. Like, I'll never forget, I had to get I had to get Neupogen shots because the chemotherapy would bring my white blood cell count to 0. And so they showed me how to do the shots, and I would just do them at home. And I will never forget, like, for the last round of treatment, I had to get my 5 shots, and the regular pharmacy where I had them didn't have didn't have them. Like, you're going to have to go to another pharmacy. So I went to another pharmacy and I got the shots, and I realized, oh my goodness, these needles have a way bigger gauge than the original ones. And so I learned very quickly this was the most painful part of my day because these needles were horrific. So on the very last day, I'm like, you know what? This is it. I dumped the bag out, and the last shot kind of fell on the bed. And right next to it were 5 adapters together that would actually have made the needle smaller. And just like for the self-flagellation of making a mistake like that, I jammed the big needle into my leg when I could have made it easier.
Yeah.
Like, as if cancer didn't beat you up enough, you figure out ways to help it along the way. So I have learned, and I just get such joy in being able to be a small part in making someone else's cancer journey easier.
I want to just reference your book quickly too, the Half Book, and I know that was 2015 when that came out.
Yeah.
Just talk about just your impetus to write it, because it's really it's such a great compilation of what was going on with you at that time.
So the way it happened, a friend of mine, or rather, I was sent a manuscript, and it was a book, and they're like, hey, can you maybe help me get this published? And I read it, and there was something so missing, and I couldn't figure out what it was. And so I reached out and I said, I'm going to have like someone who writes books read this, because I don't know what I'm missing. I knew 3 authors. One wrote Baroque spy novels, so he was out. Another one, he's still a writer today, and he writes Lifetime movies and like Hallmark Christmas movies. It's crazy. And so the third person was someone who ghost wrote a book for a lady here in town named Terry Gree. She's a stage 4 colorectal cancer survivor. She got diagnosed, started going through treatment, and 6 months later ran the Kona Ironman. Like, she's unbelievable. And the girl who wrote her book her name is Amy Markscores. So Amy and I met, and I handed her the manuscript. I'm like, can you help me with this? She goes, yeah. She goes, and what about your book? And I laughed in her face. And I said, what do you mean, my book? She goes, well, you should write a book. I've read your blogs. They're pretty funny. And I said, you have to be all kinds of nuts to write a book. Like all the work it would take. And you just said it. I am a blog writer. She goes, Dan, the first book I ever wrote was nothing but a collection of blogs strung together. And she goes, just literally write each chapter like an extended blog, come up with an outline. And so I had an outline, and I wrote it out, and it was literally, I knew where the story wanted to go. I wrote out like 24 things, like kind of like guideposts. Right. And then I literally just wrote between the guideposts. And like, we met like the next week, and she told me like what she would change about this. And she goes, and how are you doing? Have you started writing? I'm like, you know what? I wrote a few chapters. She goes, email it to me. Tell me what, I'd like to read it. So I'd written maybe 6 chapters, and I sent it off to her. And the next day I got a Cinderella email from her, and it said, I know how this story ends, but you've literally left me on the edge of my seat. You need to finish this. So I did in the next 3 weeks. And
oh, wow.
We met for coffee again, and it was the easiest thing in my life. And it's one of the most cathartic things I've ever done. It was like self-therapy, like just like writing everything out. And you're like, oh, well, now I can put that down. And I'll never forget, I handed her the manuscript. She goes, what's this? I'm like, it's the book. She goes, no, really, what is this? I'm like, no, it's the book. And she goes, nobody writes a book in a month. Stephen King doesn't write a book in a month. And I said, nobody told me I couldn't. And so the book that you read took a month to write.
Wow.
But it just poured out. I'm a word puker. I would literally just write for 3 hours, and like the chapter would be done, and I would read through it, and I'd be like, yeah, that makes sense. Or I'd change like a word here or a word there. And that's how I wrote. So I think there's like 26 chapters, and Amy is actually the one who wrote the foreword. And I was really blessed, just like some of the people who actually read a couple of the chapters and contributed to the back of the book. Like, one was a very big higher up at the time at the American Cancer Society. Another was a guy named John O'Leary, who he's just like an amazing human who is changing the world. Another was Doug Ullman, who used to be like the CEO of Livestrong, like actually read a couple of chapters and you're like, oh no, You need to share this with the world. Like, this is great. So I just had, it's been amazing. What I think the things that really hit hard though are parts that you don't expect are going to hit people hard. So I talk about this story in the book where I lost my hair, and how it was like day 7 after I'd started chemo and I still had all my hair, and I'm like, I totally beat this. And then on day 8, there was hair all over the bed. I'm like, oh no. And I took a shower and I'm literally pulling it out in
Yeah.
clumps. And so I went downstairs. My mom goes, "What are you going to do?" I'm like, "I'm going to shave my head." Like, I mean, it's a typical thing. Like, I'm taking my ball and going home. I am not going to let chemotherapy take my hair. I am going to take my hair. And she goes, "Well, okay." And I'm like, "I just have to go clean up the tub. There's hair all over it." She goes, "You know what? You go ahead and do what you need to do, and I will clean the tub for you." Well, this was early in treatment. So after I left, my mother raced upstairs and she literally got all the hair and she put it in an envelope, kind of like you do when your kiddo gets, his first haircut. And because she didn't know whether I was going to live or die, and she wanted something physical to have of me. Well, a friend of mine who read the book, she had had a baby die of SIDS.
Mm.
And one of the last things they did was they got a lock of the baby's hair. And so apparently that had been in the envelope, and she had literally tried to bury all of these feelings because, like, she had never grieved, and she didn't know if she could handle grieving. And apparently when she read that passage, she unloaded, and just everything came out. And she sent me a message that said, "I have finally been allowed to grieve. Thank you so much." And like, that was a punch in the gut
Yeah.
that you just didn't see coming. So, like, when you hear things like that, and you hear that some folks who read it, like it's changed something in them, or like it's gotten them kind of off their couch to do something to try and make the world a better place. That is the greatest validation in the world of, you know what, we did something right.
Right. I agree. Yeah. Yeah. So what's next for you in life, or what anything you want to share? Your job, your family, anything?
I'm still a video producer here in St. Louis, but I do travel if anybody needs any video production work. I love to help tell people stories, and I'm really blessed to get to do it from really tiny mom and pop organizations to a lot of nonprofits. I love helping them tell their stories to help them raise money, all the way up to Anheuser-Busch. I do a lot of inside video work for them, and so far everybody's been happy, which is great. I have a freshman in college named Sam. I have a junior in high school named Ben. It was very hard on the family when Sam left, as excited as we were. My wife and I are dreading the day when our second and final child leaves the nest. I still do work with the American Cancer Society. I still do work with Cancer Support Community. I still blog on occasion, and I still just try to do whatever I can to make the world a better place, because life is the biggest gift in the world. Like, one of the things that I do, and this started probably a year after COVID. You know how, like, on Facebook, people will write in November, like a month of thanks.
Mm.
And so they will write, like, "I'm grateful for this," like day 1, day 2, day 3. I'll never forget. I used to do that. And then like over 2 Thanksgivings ago, I started it. And then something on December 1st cool happened. And I'm like, "Oh, all right, fine. Day 31, blah, blah, blah happened." And I assumed it would stop. But then something really cool happened on December 2nd. And I kind of took that as a sign. And so
Yeah.
I typed, "All right, day 32." And then I got through a year. Like, and if I missed a day, like, I would be like, day 212 yesterday. And then I would do the one for today. And I never missed. And then someone said, "Please keep doing this." Because I was only going to do it for like the month of November after that. So now I have been doing this for like 2.5 years. I'm almost to 1,000 straight days of doing it. And it has absolutely flat out changed my
Wow.
life.
Oh,
And sometimes, like, the thank you is, "I'm thankful this day's over." Like, if it's a really terrible day, I'm thankful for please God waking up tomorrow morning and having it
Right.
be a new day. And sometimes it's I'm thankful for the sound of laughter of our kids in our house. And sometimes it's like, for instance, I'm so thankful to get to chat with you today and to have you allow me to help tell my story,
Yeah.
which is huge. It's
Well,
enormous.
that's wonderful. I mean, that's it's something that we could all do if we would do it, like what you're saying, a daily thank you or daily gratitude. Excuse me. No, it's
It's It is hard. It takes a bit of one thing I've noticed though, it forces me to be in the moment. Like I'm much more aware of my surroundings now, and I'm much more aware of like the good things in the world. And you can find them just like in the littlest places. And I've learned that when I look for good in the world, I find it. And
yeah,
I tend to absorb the energy around me from people. And so, if I try to surround myself with people who
yeah,
are like trying to make a difference in the world in just the littlest, simplest ways, that's enough. That makes me happy. So yeah, I can honestly say that as cesspool-y as Facebook can get from time to time,
yeah.
I have to say that it's been lovely, like being like on a walk with our dog in the neighborhood and having someone come up. They're like, "I really like the one you put up last Tuesday." Like that really spoke to me. That is just like a reaffirmation of, yeah, this is making a difference, and all of us can make
Yeah.
differences in the world, like big or small.
So where can we find that? What is there a URL that you can share?
Oh, if you just look for Dan Duffy on
Okay.
Facebook, like it's public. So if you look for that, if anybody's interested in the book, they can find it on Amazon. So it's actually called The Half Book.
Right.
And because it's testicular cancer, the subtitle is He's Taking His Ball and Going Home. So and that's how you find it. It's available both in print, and it's also ebook as well.
And your video production company, just Google your name, or
Oh,
does it have a name or?
that's really simple. So I called it Dan Duffy Productions. And the only reason why is because I was working for a company in St. Louis and everything was going great. And then the market crash hit in '08, '09, and they went out of business. And I could come up with some really cool, slick name, but if no one knew that it was me, because I had a client list at that point.
Mm.
So I'm like, you know what? I'm going to keep it simple. It's not there's no ego in it whatsoever in regards to I'm going to name a company after myself. It's just so people could find me.
Right,
So
right.
it's danduffyproductions.com, and you'll get to see stuff that I do. If you have any questions, my email's on there. So yeah.
Okay. So my last question, Dan, is
Okay.
what song, when you hear it, do you have to sing along to it?
Oh my goodness. There's so many. That's a really good question. Mr. Brightside by the Killers is one.
Okay.
I belt that one out. I can't believe it. Dancing Queen by
Yeah, that's a
ABBA.
good, yeah, yeah.
I mean, I love that one. There really are. There's just so many. Anything by Rush, Crash Into Me by Dave Matthews, Only Love by, oh gosh, who is it? Winona Judd. So yeah,
Okay.
it sort of runs the gamut, but
Yeah, yeah, it does.
it hits me like if I'm happy enough to sing, I'm in a good place. If I'm not singing, then I'm off balance.
Yeah.
So I love to sing,
Oh, you do?
and I
Yeah,
sing primarily in the car.
yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
I'm not a big singer, but I do, same thing in the car. If there's a song I really like, it's like, okay, yeah. Usually
Do
the
you have one?
Beatles.
Beatles,
So,
nice, good choice.
yeah. Well, I just want to say thank you for being on the podcast, but for all you've done for so many people, since your cancer journey. And I mean, you really have touched so many of us. And just thank you for doing
Oh
that.
my good, thank you so much, and I have to say thank you to all the people who constantly inspire me. Like we are all in this together,
Yes.
and for every person that I've had the unbelievably good fortune to help, 10 people have helped me. So I like the here thing, oh, he's a self-made person or she's a self-made, but there are no self-made people. We are raised by the people that we surround ourselves with. And I have just been really blessed to have been able to be surrounded by just so many amazing men, women, grandparents, brothers. It's just It's been quite a ride, and
Yep.
hopefully it's not over yet.
That's right. I agree with you. Well, thanks for your time and just for being with us and all that you do, Dan. It's made a big difference. So
Thanks, Joyce.
Thank you for watching this episode of Don't Give Up on Testicular Cancer. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to our program on your favorite podcast directory. You can also visit the Max Mallory Foundation at www.maxmalloryfoundation.com/podcast to listen to previous podcast episodes or donate to the foundation. Join us again next time for another episode of Don't Give Up on Testicular Cancer.